Before we continue with actually work going into getting an LOP in CellNav, I wanted to break down just the symbology we're going to use, which is whenever you get a line of position, in TNav, you're used to just, having a line on the chart, and then maybe you label it with like the time. And that's it. When it comes to CellNav, we want to be clearer with what we're doing. So we're going to label what celestial body we measured to actually find this LOP right here. So for instance, we might say, for this case, let's just use the sun. You would just put some symbol in front to label that LOP so that people know that, oh, this was the lower limb of the sun. So this will make more sense as we move along, but just really quickly, I want to write down all the different symbols that you're gonna see as you go through, so you have a pretty strong idea of what you're gonna be dealing with. Just as I throw these down without necessarily talking about them. The first and the most common is obviously the sun. We just draw with a as just a circle with a dot in the center. And so any LOP measured from the sun is going to have that. Now, let's just break down. You can either measure an LOP when you're measuring the sun, when you're taking a side of the sun, you could either put the top of the sun on the visible horizon, or you could put the bottom of the sun on the visible horizon based on what you want to do with the sextant. Most people put the bottom. It's easier to put the bottom, but you could put the top. And it does affect the site whether you do one or the other, so you need to specify what you're doing. So we identify what part of the sun, we call it the limb of the sun, just by putting a little horizontal line either at the top or the bottom. So you could have here is the upper limb, just means that we brought the top of the sun to the visible horizon, and then here is the lower limb. Nice and simple. The same goes for the moon. So for the moon, this isn't going to take that much work. Huge surprise, it's a crescent shape for the moon. And then likewise, you could do a crescent shape with a line at the top, or a crescent shape with a line at the bottom for either upper or lower. The next two that we'll use are, let's say, Mars and Venus. These are also not that difficult to understand. Mars and Venus, male, female. That's something you've seen plenty of times before. Not that difficult. These are technically all astrological symbols, so they've been around for thousands of years for whatever purpose, and they've gotten a lot of different cultural connotations. So in this case, we're going to use this symbol for Mars and this one for Venus. Now the next two we're going to use are Saturn and Jupiter. We'll do Jupiter first. I'll write it out. Now, for Mars and Venus, the planets are nearly little dots. So the sun and the moon are obviously large enough that you could measure the lower limb or the upper limb. And stars are small enough that you can't. They're just one single dot in space, and you can only measure it. The planets are kind of in between the two, as they're really, really small, but you could theoretically see the difference between the two. And if you look at a planet on a sextant, you can kind of tell where the top or the bottom is. So you could theoretically measure the lower limb or the upper limb of Mars, but it's not likely. Most times people treat them like stars. And the same is true for Jupiter and Saturn. So Jupiter, I couldn't really explain to you why, but its symbol is this. So imagine a 4, but with just this loopy thing at the front. And then we go into the 4. So that's Jupiter. Now Saturn is almost kind of along the same lines. where it's like that. So imagine an H with just a loopy thing at the bottom here. So these are really the only two that are going to kind of trip you up. Everything else is pretty easy to understand. But if ever you see this or this, just know that the loopy 4 is Jupiter and the loopy H is Saturn. I should think of some kind of mnemonic to remind you of that. But ultimately, it's just two symbols you need to memorize. Otherwise, they're all pretty easy. Now, the last one are stars. And honestly, this is the easiest of them. It's just a star. The one difference is if you were to have an LOP and you just drew that on it and then like labeled the time, that's enough. That's all you need. Everyone would see, okay, this is an LOP of Venus at 10:12. You don't need to explain any further, and you could do that with any of these symbols. Though for the sun and the moon, you would need to have the upper and lower limb respectively. When it comes to stars, though, there's obviously thousands of stars. You need to name it. So if you were to have an LOP of a star, instead of just having the symbol and a time, you would have to draw the star and then give the name, let's say this one's Spica, at 9:12. Obviously, you couldn't measure a star at 9 in the morning, but anytime you have a star LOP, you want to put the star symbol and then its name and then the time. Whereas with any of the other bodies, you just put the symbol and then the time. If you've got the sun and the moon, you would put the symbol and then identify whether it's the upper or lower limb, and then you would put the time. Nice and simple. Realistically, just do whatever you need to do to memorize these two, and then the rest, it's not even something you really need to worry about.